Okay. Hello? This won't show in the recording, I think, or the timing, because I do all this in advance and have a backlog so that I can take a few days off once in a while. But we're back. I suppose I am as emotionally stable as I'm going to get. So this book is called Colossus, The Price of America's Empire by Neil Ferguson. It's basically about the claim that the United States is an empire, the history of empires, and the modern age, and so on. Except it's quite interesting in a way, because this was published in 2004. So it's not a book that is too old, but it's also not a book written in the last 2 or 3 years. So China really takes a back burner on this. The EU is seen as important. The outcomes of Iraq and Afghanistan are unknown, although 9/11 has happened and we have invaded Iraq and Afghanistan. So it's interesting in that I'm looking at it and I'm going, okay, what has the future brought? Right? It's past the Soviet Union, it's past 9/11 and so on. So it has to do with our modern political situation, more or less. It doesn't mention Russia at all, really, which is sort of interesting. And I suppose we'll get into it. Okay, so first of all, it sees America as an empire, but not an empire in the old way, right? Not an empire in that we go in and militarily conquer a place, take control of it, colonize it, work with the local people that we've put in charge who work for us. We collect taxes from our overseas territories, and so on and so on. Instead, it characterizes the United States as a hegemony. Right? The hegemon's principal function in the 20th century was to underwrite a liberal international commercial and financial system. In what became known somewhat inelegantly as hegemonic stability theory, the fundamental question of the post-war period was how far and for how long the United States would remain committed to free trade, once other economies benefiting from precisely the liberal economic order being possible, the view of hegemony begin to catch up. Okay. So essentially, I see his point here, right? The U.S. as a hegemony. That is, militarily, U.S. superpower. Economically, U.S. superpower. Politically, U.S. superpower. It is, or at least during this time period, 2004, when I was a kid, we live in a unipolar world where all sorts of countries can do all sorts of things, but most countries are going to look at the United States and ask, what is the U.S. doing? Right? That is, the actions of the U.S., the economic issues of the U.S., the military adventures of the U.S. are in the background of every decision made by every country the world over. How will the U.S. react to this? Is there likely to be a war? Is there likely to be a battle? Is this going to have economic consequences for us from the point of view of the U.S.? The UN is controlled, or at least funded, by the U.S. The U.S. has military bases in 140 countries, right? And massive amounts of money are in the U.S. The U.S. underwrites the financial system, the dollar is a reserve currency, and so on and so on and so on. So the U.S. exerts influence more than it is an empire by pure force. It suggests, it pushes, it moves in certain ways, it can act for itself without regard of how other countries are going to act towards it, right? Whereas other countries can't act towards the U.S. uncaring about what the world thinks, because the U.S. essentially is enough of the world, economically, militarily, politically, that it holds outsized weight compared to the idea of the UN, right, where every country is equal. The US is not equal. It is first among equals. It is a hegemony. And if you want to work outside the US system, you're going to experience problems. Countries aren't going to be your friends. The financial system of the planet is something you're going to have to work around. You're going to try to pay people in rubles or yuan or Bitcoin, right, instead of American dollars. And this incurs an extra cost, an opportunity cost at the very least. So the writer compares this to the British Empire, and they provocate a bit back and forth between whether Britain's an empire and the US is an empire in the British mold. But what they're trying to say is that, British imperialism was based upon extremely low numbers of people. You might have, I want to say a British colony in Timbuktu, let's say, and you're going to have 50 British administrators and 500,000 locals. So that in order to rule this land, rule this area, control it, you have to have local support, or at least local folk of power and influence who benefit from Britain remaining the colonial power. You don't have to use your soldiers wildly, you just have to have the threat of soldierly activity. And Britain's rule is much more direct still, right? That is, you have a colonial administrator, you have the rules that Britain puts into place, you have British soldiers on the streets, you have a system whereby the funding is controlled by Britain, and so on and so on. The book goes into this later, and it's quite interesting. It gets quite interesting. But here, a further distinction was introduced by John Gallagher and Ronald Robertson in their seminal 1953 article on the imperialism of free trade. This encapsulated the way the Victorians used their naval and financial power to open the markets of countries outside their colonial ambit. The British did not formally govern Argentina, for example, but the merchant banks of the City of London exerted such a powerful influence on its fiscal and monetary policy that Argentina's independence was heavily qualified. Right, so British did not rule Argentina, but Argentina needed Britain for its government to work, to be funded. If you wanted to build roads, British banks had the money. If you wanted to create trade routes, you worked with British ships and British rules and British laws of the maritime seas and so on. Yet Britain did also have its direct colonies, and over time these transitioned to become more independent. The US is different than Britain in that it doesn't claim to be an empire. It doesn't directly rule very many places at all. And its influence, while powerful and strong, is not so extreme as to direct and command the activities of a certain nation. And what I mean by this is, if Nigeria decides to say, screw the US, we're not going to have anything to do with them, then the US, by and large, works with this. Okay? That is, the US, hey, you don't want to trade with us, you don't want to follow our laws, you don't want to follow our rules, that's fine. Just don't sponsor terrorism, don't try to make deals with us, you want to have nothing to do with us, go ahead. But if you let US interests inside, US, I want to say, companies, if you let a US military base inside your country, if you use your issues to fight with your neighbors, if you become involved, if you're Iraq and you become involved with a little war with Iran, then the US is going to take an interest in you now, because we have interstate conflict going on, and the US sees itself as the world's policeman, and the US is behind the UN, which is, at least nominally, supports the idea of guaranteeing the borders of independent countries, and so on and so on and so on. So the reality is quite different than the theory, okay? That is, a country may say, screw the US, we want nothing to do with it, we're going to be a little hermit, but that country then involves itself with other countries around it. That country has to have cross-border trade. That country becomes involved in the dollar system, and so on and so on. Now, I think it's interesting to note that there is no country on the planet that really is free of American influence. Okay, the difference, I think, between Britain and the US, I would venture, is that the modern US doesn't launch military adventures to open up markets. Now, the US has done this. Why did Japan enter the modern age? Because the US White Fleet under Commander Perry showed up in Tokyo Bay one day, fired a few cannons, and said, open the gates or we'll knock them down. So the US has engaged in imperialist activities, has done exactly that. It's just that today I think it's a little more nebulous. Now, this interest, though, this idea that I have of how the way the world works is, however, set in a very short era, right? Think back before 1991. Think back when the Soviet Union existed, and how many countries were there on the planet that could keep out of the US's sphere of influence and also the Soviet Union's sphere of influence. And as soon as you were in the sphere of influence of one of those, as soon as you were in an in-between spot, then both of them wanted you under their own influence, wanted to spread communism or capitalism. And so they saw themselves engaged in this great war. But after the fall of the Soviet Union, this sort of fell by the wayside for a while. And then the US became involved in the war on terrorism. Okay. And then the US tried to get the UN to be more active, and the UN did not appreciate this, and so on and so on. It gets a little more complicated. And then as we enter the modern age, I think there are countries who, because we are starting to become multipolar, you do not have to interact or be under the thumb of U.S. hegemony necessarily. You can ally yourself with other countries. The U.S. news calls them rogue countries. But I would argue that Iran and Russia are the only real rogue countries out there right now. Rwanda might be something on that as well, with its issues in the Congo. But those are the ones that come to mind immediately at the moment. I have to look more into the political situation in Venezuela. I'm sure there's an island nation somewhere that's going through turmoil, and probably a few in Africa that are going through turmoil. And it gets more complicated, right? Because it becomes not just what is the actual case, but what do people believe is the case, right? Do people think the American hegemony still holds? Does the U.S. act as if it does? The current administration has been pushing tariffs a lot, but really, how do countries react to tariffs? They say, well, we better start trading with people besides the U.S. because these tariffs are rising, so the U.S.'s power actually weakens, is what I would expect to see over the next couple of decades. That U.S. trade power weakens precisely because of its political instability. Regarding its trade procedures and goals, its tariff goals and so on. That is the U.S. still committed to free trade, or is the U.S. not committed to free trade? And perhaps the question we should ask about the U.S. hegemony is not necessarily, does the U.S. rule, but can the current way the world works continue to function without the U.S.? If the U.S. raises its tariff sky high, if the U.S. withdraws its military base, if the U.S. economy starts to go into a nosedive, then how is the rest of the world going to react to this? What does the rest of the world do? Does Russia invade someplace else? Does the Middle East fall into wars and battles? Does it all calm down? We look at Israel like, well, what sort of, without U.S. support, what does Israel do? You look at China, you're asking, well, so if China replaces the U.S. as the most powerful country, militarily or economically, what do they do? How do they act differently than the U.S. does? It certainly won't be a system that is as open, I would argue. That is, not necessarily does the U.S. rule, but is the U.S. necessary? That is, what does the U.S. system uphold? If the dollar is not the reserve currency, and instead we switch to a system of many different reserve currencies, the dollar, the pound, the euro, the yuan, and so on, then what effect does that have on the economy? How does that splinter trade and slow growth and so on? What happens to smaller countries when it's not so clear anymore that, hey, you just do what the U.S. says and you get some bonuses, where now you have to, as we are today, going between the U.S. and China and the EU and deciding, okay, which system do we want to follow? Who do we want to be friends with? Which rules do we want to have? How do we want to trade? What are our opinions on Taiwan, for example? And so on and so on. Okay, so back to the American empire, or hegemony. Okay, 13. Who benefits from this empire? Some would argue that only its wealthy elite does. Specifically, that part of its wealthy elite associated with the Republican Party and the oil industry. The conventional wisdom on the left is that the United States uses its power to impoverish people in the developing world. Others would claim that many millions of people around the world have benefited in some way or another from the existence of America's empire, and that the economic losers of the post-Cold War era, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, are victims not of American power but of its absence. For the American empire is limited in its extent. Okay, so we have this idea, is America good or bad for the world? So this book is going to argue that America is good. It's going to argue that Europe, for example, has benefited from a peace dividend, that Japan and South Korea were able to grow and increase their technology, their trade, and so on under the American nuclear umbrella by using the peace of the seas. Like, one thing that America has done quite well, which is interesting, to say the least, is that America, for the most part, guarantees open seas. That internationally open seas are guaranteed today by the United States of America and no other country on Earth. Other places do their part, but if the U.S. Navy disappeared tomorrow, then the world's seas, its shipping containers, its trade routes on the ocean would become quite a bit more dangerous rather quickly, I feel. Right? Who's going to patrol sea lanes to stop hijackings or pirates? When you have like the Houthis in Yemen firing missiles at passing ships, then the Suez Canal sees a precipitous drop. And then those ships that would go through the Red Sea, I believe, go around the Horn of Africa. This adds trade issues. This creates extra time on the seas. This raises insurance rates and so on. This causes other nations to become interested now in Yemen and what's happening there, and think that maybe they should interfere because their ships and their trade is being interdicted. This raises the issue of, like, in the South China Sea. What if China one day decides to declare that South China Sea is entirely its own, and they're going to fire on any ship that doesn't pay them a tithe to pass through? Well, what happens to all the shipping from Korea and Japan and the Philippines and Vietnam if China decides, hey, we could cut their shipping in half by just charging a little bit of money to pass through our oceans? What happens when the Panama Canal takes on extra importance and something like Colombia or Venezuela starts having a civil war or starts attacking one of its neighbors? What if that spreads and now Panama, it certainly is not a military power, is something people start looking at? What if 1,000 different things happen, right? It's only recently that GPS has existed with a system that was not U.S. controlled, owned, and operated, right? The global positioning system are U.S. satellites. The U.S. paid to put up into space, and the U.S. runs. Now, some other countries, China, for example, launched recently a few satellites for its own version of GPS, but that's very new. What if the U.S. GPS system shuts off? The U.S. government decides it doesn't want to pay for it anymore. What happens to global shipping then? What happens to every Uber on the planet when your phone doesn't quite work the same? And you have to put in all this extra effort to reprogram it or listen to the Chinese system and so on, or some other country like the EU launches a version of it, and now you have competing versions back and forth. So that is what this book is trying to argue, is that the U.S. benefits from a stable world because the U.S. is in a very important position. That is, the U.S. is a maritime empire, right? The U.S. controls space to an extent. The U.S. has the greatest air force. The U.S. controls, or at least influences, let's say, international law as far as that exists and is followed. Without that, now the world splits, and economic growth is so much easier when everyone uses the dollar. The world is so much easier to navigate when you can use English everywhere. Like, I can verify this 100%. I've been to a dozen countries where I didn't speak the language, but I was American, and then I spoke English. And it turned out that everywhere you went, there was someone who spoke English. I could be in the middle of a third-class city in Vietnam, and the old lady who runs the corner store comes out and speaks like 10 words of English. No, yes, thank you. Just really basic stuff. And why does this work? Because of U.S. hegemonic power. Right? I once had it was like my apartment manager, and she was telling me that she once worked for a Korean company and had a Japanese boss. It's like a multinational Korean company, but her boss was Japanese. And so she communicated with her boss and the company. That is her direct boss, the Japanese, right? She communicated with the boss and her company in English. Why did she communicate in English? The history of America, right? It's so much easier to have international companies with a lingua franca. If you all have to learn, French and English and Chinese and Japanese and Spanish in order to communicate with all your people, that's not going to be very useful. Right? You can have a very small number of people who can actually jet set around the world. But if you all have some comfort with English, that's quite good. So who benefits from the empire? Who benefits from American hegemony? I would say, or at least the book would argue, and I agree with him in many ways, that quite a lot of people do. The issue, of course, is twofold, I would say. One is, just because some people benefit does not mean everybody benefits. And okay, so you, the person watching this, can probably figure this out better than I can. Who do you know who doesn't benefit? Who do you think doesn't benefit? Right? Well, for example, Iran isn't benefiting from this. Russia isn't benefiting from this, at least as far as they see it. And China is benefiting from this and has benefited for a very long time, which is something the book points out, that the U.S. and China are actually in more of an interdependence relationship. Right? I mean, what if China had to secure the safety of the internet of the seas? What if China had to deal with the fact that there were civil wars all over Africa? How much are you investing in places when, I don't know, Cambodia is erupting in war, or Sri Lanka is fighting itself, or India and Pakistan are tossing nukes at each other? And why don't they? Well, the existence of the U.S. is at least an influence upon issues like that. And this is the primary domestic U.S. complaint, that we feel like we are the policemen of the world. The book will talk about this as well, right? That like in Iraq, the invasion of Iraq, there were UN resolutions against Iraq. There were all sorts of problems. Iraq was supporting terrorism in Europe, for gosh sakes, and the EU wanted nothing to do with this. The EU had no intention of launching an invasion or stopping or actually doing anything at all, right? I mean, sure, Iraq gave some money to some terrorists that blew up a building in London, but Britain isn't going to do anything about that. They're going to say, okay, we're going to put some economic sanctions on you and send you a harshly worded letter. I know you gave money to people who killed 400 of our folk, but it's not big enough for us to invade, right? The old British Empire 150 years ago would have sent gunboats in 3 seconds. Right? The U.S. is interventions, especially in the early 2000s in the Middle East, were motivated by terrorist attacks on the United States. There were plenty of other reasons, and there's certainly an actionable issues the U.S. did. Right? The U.S. is involved these countries already because there's oil there, because of Israel, and so on, but not launching massive military invasions with 1 million troops sort of involved. Instead, it's just sort of low-level issues, which then explode one day. Okay. And so the other issue with American, or the American idea, at least, that we were act as world policemen, is the U.S. is, I would say, caught between two ideas. And the book talks about this as well. Right? If we are the world's policemen, that is, it is American military intervention which helps to halt the spread of terrorism in Africa. Right? That is, the U.S. is supplying arms. The U.S. is guaranteeing safety. The U.S. is sending troops to train the Army of Chad or something. If the U.S. is allied with Israel and yet also guaranteeing the safety of Qatar and Saudi Arabia, right? And they end up playing both sides of the game. And if the U.S. is protecting Korea and protecting Japan and protecting the EU and guaranteeing, the safety of the Panama Canal and stuff like this, what is the U.S. getting out of it? Like, why is the U.S. doing this? The U.S. is benefited because of the hegemony. In effect, I would agree. But also, Americans, people in the United States of America, domestically, are constantly thinking, why are we doing this? Why are we involved in the world? There's always been this drive in the United States to be isolationist. Because the ideal... Okay, let me try to put this... How do I put this? The ideal world, from the point of view of the U.S., is very, 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 very simple. Nobody fights each other. That's it. Okay? And that is that, Russia and China and Iran and terrorist movements and the Balkans and Venezuela, they don't fight each other. The borders of the world are mostly set. The countries mostly run themselves. You don't have massive civil rights violations. Why don't you have massive civil rights violations? Because what do massive civil rights violations cause? People to leave your country and flood into other countries, and now you have refugees. Okay? And what does this do? This causes tension between countries, and now you've got to fight. Right? Why do so many Middle Eastern countries dislike Israel? Is Israelis drove a bunch of Palestinians out, and those Palestinians went somewhere, other places in the Middle East. And now you have massive numbers of people who have horrific understandings about the place in the world of the state of Israel. And so half the Middle East goes, this is a bad idea. The governments might not think so or act so, but you get enough people, and there's that push, causing conflict. And it doesn't have to be fighting outright and directly. It just has to be, it could be a trade dispute, right? It could be China not quite following all the rules it agreed to. It could be some country cutting off oil supplies. It could be some country saying, we will accept a Russian military base here. And so on and so on and so on. That is, the U.S. wants to be focused on trade. The U.S. and the people of the United States want to be focused on humanitarian activities. They want to be focused on doing good in the world. They don't want to be focused on, fighting battles that aren't any of our problem to begin with. That is, aren't any of our problem in that nobody attacked us and we didn't attack anybody else. Right? The U.S. is not directly involved in disputes between Saudi Arabia and Yemen. The U.S. is not directly involved in disputes between Israel and Iran, or between Russia and Ukraine, or between Chad and New Guinea and I don't know why I can't think of any African countries because I'm trying to think of African countries and then my head freaks out and then I'm start getting tense and then I'm like I would know you mentioned these countries I would know Nigeria or something. Gosh, your head goes blank under pressure and so on. You're like I should know this name but I don't know the name. There's like 50 names to choose from and I recognize you'd say the name of the country in Africa and I know what it was. But now that I'm freaking out about it, it's like in South America, I'm like, okay, there's like Colombia, Chile, and gosh, something Argentina. Right? I'm like, I know these. What's north of us again? It's Canada and Greenland belongs to Denmark. You know, the map of the world in my brain is a little. I think the map of the world in my head is somewhat more clearly linked to places I've heard about in the news. A lot of the African countries tend to blur together. Whereas when we talk about like Southeast Asia, I've been to many of them. So in my head, I go, okay, I know where that one is and that one is and that one is because I flew to it. Because I can link the name with a picture and a face and a people I knew and stuff like that. You know, the U.S. would be quite happy to withdraw its military bases if it didn't feel those military bases were needed. Or at least U.S. domestic opinion would be. You know, the point of view of the U.S. imperialist and government, it might be a bit more complex. And the idea is that we can always reach an agreement. You talk about like the Middle East, right? So this is honestly, I'm pretty sure what the American populace thought about both Iraq and Afghanistan. All right, so we hear, you know, like as kids, like I'm in 5th grade. I'm in middle school. I barely even know what the Middle East is. I couldn't find Iran on a picture on a blank map of the globe because I'm 11 or something. But the sense I got at the time and in the years since and growing up in middle school was like that America thought, all right, Afghanistan and Iraq, these are places which are horrible, run by terrorists or dictators, and they're very poor. So what we're going to do is we're going to go in there, we're going to overthrow the evil demon or whatever, or the evil organization or the commies or the Taliban or Saddam, whoever they're called, I don't know. And then we're going to get all the people together and we're going to say, all right, now you are free, form a democracy, and then all these groups are going to form a democracy and work together. Kumbaya. We're all good. The Americans leave. The Afghanis or the Iraqis are now in charge of their own destiny, and they get along. And sure, there's going to be problems and troubles, but we can talk about that, and we'll work it out. Instead, what happens, and this sense that you get growing up in the U.S. is that what happens is that the U.S. goes to a place, intervenes against an evil dictator or against some commie government or against who knows what, overthrows the government or assists in a movement that is already trying to overthrow the government, and then new people get put in charge. The U.S., with the help of U.S. support, the U.S. says, all right, great, U.S. leaves, these people immediately fight. And partially this view, I think, comes from the history of European colonialism, right? Because that's what our history focuses on in school. For example, India and Pakistan. 99% of people in the United States have no understanding of what on earth drives India and Pakistan to dislike each other so much. Is it religious? Is it cultural? Is it political? Like, what's the beef here? What's the reason? You're next to each other, even neighbors. We look at you had India was a colony, the Indian subcontinent was a colony of Britain, and then Britain left, and it was all fine, and then they started fighting each other. And then you had Bangladesh was, like, why does Bangladesh have that weird shape again? It's like, we don't get it. This is from the American political experience, American history of political experience, right? Is the myth we get told as children. We entered the country, we killed a bunch of Indians, and we mostly got along. We had one civil war, and then we got over it. And then we had a few issues around civil rights and so on, but then we got over it, and now we live in a post-racial, post-crisis, post-everything war world without even this threat of communism, and we're all safe. This, of course, is not how the world works, but it's what you're told, what you feel growing up, and then eventually you learn it's more complex. But you look at, like, the average American looks at Mexico and goes, okay, so there's a bunch of drugs flowing through Mexico, and there's a bunch of corruption. So who's really in charge? Like, who wants to do something about this? All right, do you want U.S. help? Like, if Mexico called up the U.S. today, like, the idea I think that most American citizens have is that if the president of Mexico called up the president of the United States and said, you know what, we want to get rid of these drugs, what help can you give us? And the U.S. will be ready to extend its hand and say, we will help you get rid of these drugs, whatever you want. Here's the plan. Here's what we got. Let's go and do it. Of course, this isn't exactly how it works. Mexico has its own issues and systems and pride and sovereignty, really. The U.S. wants things done a certain way, but then you're spending U.S. money doing it, and so on and so on and so on. Now the U.S. government, U.S. politicians are involved, and you have internal political issues driving external military issues, and it becomes very disturbing. Right? The U.S. looks at Taiwan in China and says, I don't understand what the problem is. All right, Taiwan is independent. If Taiwan wants to rejoin China at some point, then it can go ahead and do that. So why is China got to stick up its butt about Taiwan? I mean, if Taiwan's a part of China, then Taiwan can decide to join China. I mean, we're not stopping it. We're not holding it back. They could hold a referendum today and decide to join. It is because the sentiments on the island itself. I mean, Taiwan has only been free of dictatorship, since like the early 1980s? Like, what's the big rush? We look at Iran and we're going, why is Iran working with terrorists? We look at Russia and we're going, why is Russia trying to invade Ukraine? Can't Russia just be happy with being a Russia? But, there's all sorts of reasons for actions like this to be taken. The U.S., I think, is prone to idealism, prone to thinking, well, the world is this way, and it's a simple answer and a simple solution, and if we all just get along, it's all good, right? It's a very business-oriented viewpoint. Hey, I'll make a deal with you, you make a deal with me, let's just agree not to upset each other too much, and we'll get along with it. We're gonna agree on a few basic civil rights. We're gonna agree on a few basic rules of conduct, and we're both gonna stick to this. That doesn't happen. It doesn't even happen within the U.S. when the U.S. is talking to itself, really. And this is one of the problems of internal U.S. politics, I think, is the left thinks, well, we can just do the universal health care, for example, and bada bing. Why don't we just do that? It seems simple. Seems like a good idea. And the right is like, well, universal healthcare is bad, so we're not going to do it. And this goes on for 45 years or more. And I think most people would just like, look, if we could just agree whether it's good or bad, just like as a nation, then we could get on with the actual work of putting it together. But instead, it turns out we got all these complications. And that happens because we're human, of course. But the ideal American viewpoint is the world is simple. It's just not. So again, who benefits from the American empire? Really, America does, particularly. It's just that we seem obsessed with thinking that we don't. Right? Like America is well placed to run a seaward empire. America has no realistic realistic military enemies on her entire continent. The United States of America is the most technologically advanced, most militarily powerful, most economically rich nation on the planet, and yet you walk into an American city and you're going, we're so behind the times. You go have a medical procedure done, and you're going, oh, it cost me so much to do this. Like the average American just wants to go home, go to work, hang out with their friends, go back to work, go home, hang out with friends, take a vacation take a 2 or 3 or 4 week vacation once a year, and we're fine with working like devils in order to make some money. And that's what you want. But again, the world's not simple. And sometimes it seems like no matter what you do, it doesn't turn out well. So maybe I'm not as emotionally stable as I thought I was. Right? But like it's a common theme in America, I think. Like, well, why are we paying for foreigners to attend our colleges? Why are we paying for the security of the EU and Japan? Why are we doing this? Why are we doing that? And it's because we benefit from it, right? It's because it ensures our safety. We don't want the EU to have a bunch of weapons, because they're our friends right now, but in 100 years, who knows? We don't want the EU to turn into some evil empire and have a bunch of weapons. If they're going to turn into an evil empire, better it be without a bunch of weapons. It's the same with Japan and Taiwan and the Philippines. We're happy to provide some security for you. Why? Because this means you're not fighting us. It's just that the American populace gets into his head that the protection of Japan and Korea is not important for us, where they should pay for their own defense. Well, yeah, but then they have weapons, and then they might use them someday, and the world becomes more dangerous. And we would like to continue trading, for example, with Japan and Korea and China, and for there not to be any incidental missiles flying around. So keep the peace. And this works because America is a trading nation. This works because America is a productive nation. We still are the second most productive nation on the planet. We have a ton of money in international trade and in cross-border arrangements. We have stock markets. We have international companies going on based in America, the biggest ones on the planet. And what does this all rely on? A very safe and calm and orderly world. It's just that you're proving a counterfactual, right? What if the US wasn't there? What if the world was more dangerous? What if we didn't have these technological advances? What if there was no American stock market? And I can say bad things would happen, but I can't prove it because it's a counterfactual. It hasn't actually happened. Like I can say, if we keep raising the deficit, bad things will happen, but I can't prove it. Why? Because the bad thing hasn't happened yet. And so you get into worldviews and who's right and who's wrong and who benefits from the American empire. Do other countries, does China benefit from an American hegemony? Does the EU benefit from an American hegemony? And if they do, then should they act in order to preserve it? That is, what part does the EU and Japan have to play in keeping the old world order going? But another question arises, right? If you are Liberia, for example, and you feel that you have not benefited from the world order, you feel that you're still a poor, backward or country, or you're Sudan and you're going through a civil war, right? or you are Argentina and you're continually in massive debt to the IMF, you might be going, you know what? I don't feel that I actually am benefiting from the world order. If you're Russia and the world is always trying to push you towards democratic reforms, you're going to say, you know what? I don't think I benefit from that. Assuming you're the one in charge. And so you push back. And it's hard to know what would have happened to Russia if after the fall of the Soviet Union, the U.S. had retreated back to its own shores. U.S. had seen the death of the great enemy and had decided to become isolationist again because no one could threaten it. Would Russia have grown? Would Russia have shrunk? Would Russia have fallen to more terrible economic malaise? Would there be war? Or would Russia have expanded dramatically by invasion? Would it have benefited economically in some way? Who knows? I'm just getting into possibles and possibles here, but it's interesting reading a book like this, which has a view of the American empire that it is more beneficial. Whereas what I've mostly been told growing up is that America is the evil place. America is bad. America does this and America does that. And America is supporting a dictator here and America is overthrowing a government there. And we're causing wars in the Middle East over oil. And we're making bad trade agreements with China or something, right? Or we are punishing some official of a country that we don't like. And there are complicated reasons behind those. Are we punishing the official because they don't like them, or because they're involved in civil rights violations, or because they've been found a criminal in some way, or because they're stealing a bunch of money from their own folk and the political powers of that country aren't strong enough? Or are we doing it because we just think that they're bad for us, or they're pushing anti-American issues, or they are nationalizing an American company, and so on and so on? It's just the history of politics. Positive, negative, who knows? The U.S. is the greatest arms dealer on the planet. But there's a difference between being the greatest arms dealer, flat out, and being the greatest arms dealer, but having agreements tied to those arms, right? Like the U.S. produced the F-35, and yet you probably have agreements with with all these countries who you've given the F-35 to, sold them missiles and planes and all these dangerous things to. You have agreements with them saying you can't use the F-35 on each other. You can't use the F-35 on the U.S. You have to ask for American permission to fly certain sorties or to use these certain missiles that we gave you, but we still control, or we permit the use of. And so, right, it's like giving a loan to somebody. I might give you money, but that's very different from saying, no, you owe me something in return. This is an equal. I'm not just giving it to you and demanding something. No, this is an equal trade. You're getting something, and I'm getting something. But then you have examples of Russian missiles or drones, including U.S. parts, and the U.S. has said it's not going to do that. But it can't even control the U.S. can't even control its own manufacturing capabilities. The U.S. can't keep its microchips from being put into Russian drones. How do you react to that? How do you react when you are technically supporting both sides of a war? And what this book basically says is the American empire building activities have consistently followed a certain pattern, which is basically absent-mindedness. The U.S. is very, very good at sending troops into some place for 6 months or a year and then getting out. The U.S. does this very, very often, is quite ready to do it. Use economic sanctions, send a gunboat, that sort of thing. Get in, and then it gets out. Get in, get out. Get in, get out. Get in, get out. I mean, at one point, it's like it mentions some country in South America where the U.S. invaded like 17 times in the course of 20 years. And it's saying, well, the U.S., like in Africa, the U.S. is known for that. You send in the military and then you get out. In Kuwait, in the Desert War, U.S. sends in the military, protects the place, gets out. Why? Because it goes back to the American ideal again. The ideal American view of another country is that other countries mostly work and democracy mostly works as long as these countries don't fight each other. And if there's a civil war going on, then we support one side wins, and then that is the winner, and it's all fine. Doesn't work like that. You have consistent, long, ongoing conflicts. I think the viewpoint of most people, most civilians in the United States was essentially, invade Afghanistan, invade Iraq, go ahead. It doesn't sound like a terrible, bad decision. When, however, we stayed and you had people dying and IEDs and dangers and we were worried about terrorism, and it seemed like the U.S. just couldn't fix the problem, then public opinion started to turn. It wasn't the activity of the U.S. government that didn't like. It was some of the scandals, the Dick Cheney money laundering bits of news that get bandied about as possible issues. Those aren't popular. But generally speaking, we're going in, we're helping people. And then we start hearing messages and stories. Oh, we're not actually helping people. Oh, the U.S. is blowing people up, right? I mean, when the U.S. launches a missile at a terrorist and happens to blow up during a wedding for his niece, that's good in the sense that it kills the terrorist, right? But we're also all hearing this and going, wait a second, we seem like the bad guys because we just launched a missile at a wedding. And America begins to doubt itself. It's all about the story. America it's a land built on the story of the United States. And when that story starts to degrade or fall apart, it falls apart really, really fast. And part of that issue, I think, comes from the tendency Americans have to lie to themselves. This is from the very beginning of our country, right? What do we learn? Manifest destiny. Go west, young man. Forge your own life out of a barren rock and sand. Make a farm, mine for gold, start a business. You can do it out of nothing. Pull yourself up by your own bootstraps. And you look at history and go, oh, great, we murdered our way across the continent. Right? You look at history where this is a land of freedom and opportunity, and you go, oh, great, we had slavery, and then we had discrimination. Now we've got racism and sexism. And all these stories we told ourselves turned out to be a little more complex. It's the same with American empire, right? We think, okay, look, America, mightiest country on the planet, that means we should be rich and powerful, right? And it turns out that's not exactly the case. We are rich and powerful compared to other places. That doesn't mean we're rich and powerful compared to what we think we should be. And so the American empire starts to suffer. Okay? One bit that's important, I think, to understand about American hegemony, right? American military power, about American independence is that there is not a single country on this planet today which is a realistic threat to the American mainland. The American government itself, its governmental institutions, will not fall to anything less than nuclear annihilation. Right? Nobody is invading the continental United States where guns outnumber people. No one is going to be overthrowing the U.S. government from the inside unless the U.S. government allows itself, unless the U.S. people allow their own institutions to fall apart. No one is going to be destroying American technology anytime soon. But America feels the story America tells itself over and over again is we are under threat. We are under threat. The world is a dangerous place. And why do we feel it? At least partially, I think, is because the United States is a very dangerous place. I have walked in countries all over the planet, and the only place where I've actually been assaulted in the middle of the street is in the United States of America. I might worry about pickpockets, but I might worry about pickpockets in Europe. I might worry about getting lost in the middle of Vietnam. I might worry about being scammed in Korea. I might worry about some extremely aggressive carpet salesman in Istanbul. I might worry about getting involved with a drug cartel somehow in Mexico. But the one place on the planet where I'm going, okay, if I walk down the street, I might die because someone's going to mug me with a knife or a gun. And it's the United States. And so we take this feeling we have and we extend it to the rest of the world. The rest of the world must be this dangerous. And it simply is not. At least most of the first world is not. The story is always terrorism and death, and Russia is going to attack us, or China is going to attack us, or the Soviet Union or Iran. They got nukes, and North Korea has it. Oh my gosh. And I don't know. I don't feel the world, like, the world is dangerous, yeah. But as regards the nation state, it's not nearly as dangerous as we think it is. It's like Israel, for example. The Palestinian movement has no actual hope of destroying the Israeli state, the Israeli country. They simply don't have the power or the capability, the ability to destroy enough buildings, for example, to deal with millions of folk. Iran does not have the ability to destroy utterly the entire country of Israel without building and utilizing a nuke, which is a long-term project, right? People know about this years beforehand. If China can invade Taiwan, but it's going to have a hell of a time holding it, for example. World War III could erupt, but I feel it's more likely to be a slow simmer than a sudden avalanche. And this is, however, not how the United States of America, or at least its interior population, I feel, understands the world. Most people in the United States look at the planet and say it's dangerous. It's bad. There's people out to get us. There's countries that want to destroy us. And it's like, yeah, sure, Iran wants to destroy us. Iran can't destroy us. It would take 30 years, and we would see it coming from 15 years off. If China or Russia invading us, like if they launch nukes and we launch nukes and it's nuclear Armageddon all over again, or it takes years to even begin to threaten the United States. Look at Russia's attack on Ukraine, how miserably that failed. Now imagine they start invading the EU proper. No, my understanding, my feeling is simply that it's not likely. And yet, walking in the streets of America, you think something's wrong. The world is dangerous. It's the same economically, right? America is under economic pressure all the time. Look how poor we are. Look how bad our roads are. Look how horrible the economy is. Look at our debt. Look at our failing infrastructure. We're going to look at all these little bits. Look, we can't find jobs and so on. And then you hear the American economy is booming and booming and booming and booming and booming for 10 years straight now. It's the same in even the Great Depression that we went through, even the market crisis of 2008. Yes, these were horrible and they made people suffer and they had terrible effects, but they were not nearly enough to destroy the United States, to destroy a way of life. It just means that there was variability in our economic outlook, in our economic existence, that there were people starving on the streets. Well, there are people starving in the streets today in the United States. And it's not because we can't feed the populace. It's because we choose not to do so. Because we think there's other things we should spend our money on. Same with, political issues, right? Look, whether the United States is moving in a more capitalist or socialist manner, whether the United States is becoming a welfare state or pushing away from a welfare state, these are extremely minor compared to the rule of law, compared to the Bill of Rights. And nothing external is going to threaten that. China isn't going to do away with the Bill of Rights. Russia isn't going to do away with the Food and Drug Safety Administration. What's going to do away with all that is us. And the book points this out. Okay. For the threat to America's empire does not come from embryonic rival empires to the west or to the east. I regret to say that it may come from the vacuum of power and the absence of a will to power within. It's like, what he's trying to say here is, who is the United States of America? Who is our greatest world enemy? You look at the state of international law and international finance and international politics. Who is the greatest enemy? The United States of America. And we're not the greatest enemy to Russia or China or Iran. We're not the greatest enemy to terrorist movements, to Sharia law somewhere. We're not the greatest enemy to communism or socialism, but we are the greatest enemy to ourselves. The United States of America, its internal politics are what is going to determine the future of the world during my lifetime. Yeah, Russia and China and the EU, they have an effect. And yet, one of those groupings by themselves is not as effective as the United States of America by itself. Simply put, we're still the greatest power on the planet. Militarily by a huge margin, economically by a shrinking margin, politically by a shrinking margin, but it's still large. It's just, are we going to shoot ourselves in the foot? That's the real question about the future of the United States of America. What are we going to do? Who do we want to be? How are we going to choose to exist? Do we become isolationist again? Do we raise tariffs? Do we protect ourselves? Do we say to Japan and Korea and Israel and Britain, pay us money because we're protecting you? Do we say you have to pay to protect Europe, you have to protect yourself now? Do we say that China and Russia were going to make a deal and you have influence in these areas and we have influence in these areas. Do we join together and say we have done our part to defend the world, but you need to do yours? Right now the U.S. is pushing for Europe to raise its defense expenditures. And the U.S. has been doing that for a very long time, at least since this book has been written, right? The EU has the rest of NATO, which is not the EU, I understand, right? But NATO, for example, has not, generally speaking, paid its promised monies towards its own defense. And this has a reaction. Yeah, well, what is the greatest issue in American politics today? It's the American economy. Okay, so we saw this in I want to say the 80s, right, with the oil embargoes and so on. And we saw this again in the financial crisis. And we're seeing it again today. The dollar is a reserve currency. The U.S. hegemony sits at the center of international finance. And yet the American average citizen feels as if the world has gotten, feels as if their life has gotten worse, feels that it's harder to get a job, it's harder to live well, it's harder to be healthy, it's just harder to know what to do or to vote for, it's harder to distinguish truth from lies, it's harder to even trust what your politicians are doing. It's harder to get to work. It's more expensive to buy a house. Or we can't do anything. And whose fault is this, right? There's a section of the United States which wants to say that it's the fault of foreigners, which wants to say it's the fault of the American idea that we should be the world's policeman, or because other countries have taken advantage of us, or name your poison, because other countries are sending us their refugees or trying to send us drugs or are invading us with a gang or whatnot. And really, these are issues, these are things that happen, yes. But my view of it, at least, is the greatest danger to the United States of America is the United States of America. If we want to pull together as a nation, if we have a functioning Congress that may argue, but at least does something. Like, I don't care about making the wrong decision, just do something. Instead of shutting down for 40 days and then the news today, the Democrats end up caving over healthcare. It's like, why did you even bother then? If you weren't prepared to see this out, like you knew exactly what was going to happen. You know the issues with the food stamps and so on. I'm just frustrated because of that. It's like with the Republicans in their hand, right? But like you knew that the budget put forth was total BS. You knew that you're going to cause economic problems with the tariffs. You knew that Trump was going to do what he said he was going to do, and then Congress just lets him do it instead of doing it themselves. Like, well, we're going to stand back, and it's not our fault. No, we didn't decide to do this or that. It's him, and it's so frustrating, right? Because I've grown up in the United States, and it's like, why are we having economic problems? Why aren't we building it up? Why don't we have enough housing? Because we didn't build enough houses. Why? Because we decided not to do it. As a country, as a state, as a government, as a county, we said, we're not going to build here. Build it somewhere else, not near us. We're going to have environmental standards, but we're going to put them into such an extreme, put them in with such an extreme level that they cut building like in half or something, right? We're going to go through COVID and we're going to have these silly arguments about whether we put masks on or not. Right? Like if we had all decided not to wear masks during COVID, a bunch of people would have died and we would have made a horrible decision, but it would have been a decision. If we had all decided to wear masks during COVID, not many people would have, comparatively at least, not many people would have died, or less people would have died, and we would have made a decision. But instead, we gallivanted back and forth, and we had massive protests, and people raged all about this. And I'm like, look, it doesn't matter what decision you make. It matters you make a decision. What would cause the most damage to the United States of America as a country, as a community? It wasn't the mask wearing or not the mask wearing. It was the debate over mask wearing. And not necessarily the debate itself, right? It was that the debate never came to a conclusion. There was no clear consensus. You didn't have the intellectuals and the leaders of the nation all join together as one and say, you know what, we've talked about this, and here's the discussions back and forth, and here's some studies, and the consensus is masks are good. You had some people doing that, and you had other people just going wild and saying, no, masks are bad, it's infringing on our freedoms, da 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 da. Like, yeah. But I would say, clearly you don't have much of a leg to stand on here, right? That is, I want to say, like, it's entirely different to be like, I don't want to wear a mask because it's an expression of my free speech or whatever, and I'm prepared to accept that people will die because of this. I'm like, I'm like, go ahead. If you are prepared for the consequences of your actions, I'm fine with that. I might not make the same action, but at least I can understand that you made a decision. It's when you go, oh, I'm going to wear a mask because my free expression, but also mask wearing is a fraud. And also they're trying to control us and silence us because I'm against mask wearing. And I'm like, okay, you're choosing both sides here. You're defending a scientific opinion with unscientific facts. It doesn't work that way. Same in politics, right? Look, you can make a decision. You can say, I want a small government. You can say, I want low taxes. You can say, I don't want the government to do this and this and this and this and this and this. Go ahead. Like, go vote for that. Push for that. I understand. It's when you go around, I want the government to do small, but I'm also not going to do that directly because I don't have enough support, so I'm going to cut at the institutions from behind. I'm going to allow a president to do something, and then the Congress will just not say anything. Instead of manning up and straight up saying, this is what we're for, and these are the consequences of our actions. A smaller government is a less effective government that doesn't do all these things. Because we're a divided country, right? If we just voted to universal healthcare or voted to get rid of universal healthcare, it would have been done. Instead, the debate goes on and on and on, and it's not a debate that ends because there is a consensus, right? It's not a debate that ends because the learned folk know what to do, or at least think they know what to do. It's not a debate that ends because of scientific studies or because of recommendations by working groups. It's a debate that goes on and on and on because some group or another sees a benefit in keeping this debate going alive. Some group or another is unwilling to accept the consequences of their decisions, or unwilling to accept that it's their fault for what happens. Instead, it's always somebody else's fault. They did it, or they did it, or they did it, and so on and so on. Right? In America, why don't we build more houses? We could build more houses. We could build more houses today. Why do we have an illegal immigration problem? We could solve illegal immigration today, right? You shut down the border. You make everyone who's in the country a citizen. And you say, we will now pay the price of a secure border. And it's going to cost us $1 trillion a year, but we'll do it. Instead, we go back and forth and back and forth. And we have a border, but we don't really, people slip through all the time. We have a asylum system, but there's a backlog. We're going to pick up illegals in the street, but we're also grabbing ice cream salesmen and children. It's like, we could double the number of houses in the United States in a couple of years if we said we're going to expand the zoning to such a point that you can, every house can be, you can put a second level in every house, or every house can, every place where new construction is putting in one house, you can put in 4 houses. Right? If we said we're gonna bulldoze this quarter of the city and build apartments so that everyone has a place to live, we could do it. It's just that there was a cost for that. People's houses would be taken away. It would cost an insane amount of money, right? We could do all these things, but there's a cost to them, so we don't do them. But we don't do it because of the cost. We don't do it because we're not willing to pay the cost. We do it because we're still deciding what we want to do. We do it because we don't have a clear idea. We do it because there's 1,000 different voices arguing 1,000 different ways. We do it because we have entrenched interests. We do it because the interests that want to change things are diverse, or they're very ardent about the change they want, but they don't have the power. And, the oncoming world will change. What was it? Mamdani, I think, got elected in New York. And you saw the Democrats pushing back against that, the Republicans pushing back against it, and then he won anyway. And that is, I think, like one of those moments which show that the next generation is starting to rise up again. Like my generation grew up hearing as little kids that if you work hard, you can make it. Then my generation grew up as young adults working hard and not making it. And now my generation is, in their 40s and their 30s and their late 20s going, I can't afford a house. Going, I'm still renting. Going, I'm still a child living in a garage. I'm incomplete. And then we look in the news and we go, okay, wait, we just cut taxes more, and so we're going to have healthcare problems and Social Security problems right when I'm retiring, and that doesn't seem like a good idea. We hear economy's booming and that my life is hard. We hear that America is now in a trade war with China, and that might escalate to a real war. And guess what? It's going to escalate to a real war right about the time that, like, if I have kids, right? Because people having kids, right? Grow up. Great. It's like it all comes down to my lifetime. And you hear about these dangers and dangers and dangers and dangers. And when my mother was growing up, it was the Soviet Union. It was nuclear war. And that never happened. Ideally, all these issues we're talking about, like the national, like we could solve the national debt tomorrow, right? By printing massive amounts of money and accepting the cost of inflation. We could solve national debt by raising taxes to a high enough level to have a balanced economy. But there are costs to each of those, right? Inflation, massive social costs. You want to raise taxes, massive social changes. You want to reform Social Security, someone benefits, someone loses. You want to deal with the retirement, like people are living longer, so let's raise the retirement age to 70. But there's a cost to that, a social cost particularly, right? A cost to the individual. What frustrates me isn't, I guess what frustrates me about the United States of America is not what we are, what we do. It's that we're always so confused. The book tries to point out that America has a very short attention span. We have an attention deficit. But I don't think I do particularly. I think I've heard the same sort of economic and political and social and military stalemate going on ever since I got out of high school. Ever since I started paying attention to the world and going, wait, we're pretty much in the same place at 2025. This book says we are at in 2004. Except that, well, this book is worried about the EU growing to become a rival. We're worried about China becoming a rival. But except for that, we are almost in the same place. It doesn't feel like the United States has moved. We pushed for Obamacare, right? Universal health care, but we half-assed it. We didn't finish it all the way, and now we're still fighting over it. We thought we got through the civil rights era, and then we pushed like gay marriage and so on. Like, all right, civil rights, good. And then there's this pushback. The Supreme Court is going to hear about what there was a lady somewhere in the United States, somewhere in the South, I think, or the Midwest, who knows, that was refusing to grant marriage license, and like she's going to get her day in court to explain again. And I'm like, why? I thought we fixed this. I thought we did this, and we didn't. There's just backsliding, right? Like the housing deficit. We hear about the housing deficit, and we're always thinking it's going to be someone else's problem, someone else's problem, someone else's problem. Well, now it's our problem. And again, we could fix all these issues today. It's just that there's a cost to them. But there's a cost also to staying the way we are. There's a cost to watching American hegemony fade away. There's a cost to our congressional stalemates. There's a cost to the concentration of economic powers. And that's something we don't really focus on very much as people of the United States. What happens if things just keep going the way they are? Because they aren't static. The world isn't static. Things don't stay the same. The way we live, the place we are at today is a result of choices we made when we were younger. So it is with me as an individual, so it is with the nation. It's like asking, whose fault is this? No, it is your fault, the American voter. My elders and my compatriots and the generation after me, it is your fault and my fault. And there's blame going back and forth and back and forth that it's this certain group or that certain group. Such are the issues of the day, which are the issues of yesterday, which are the issues of last generation and last century even. Like this book, I'm just on the introduction, and it's talking about Britain. And how the United States is like the British Empire. Look what happened to that. It was an empire that self-dissolved. So is that what's going to happen? Is it just America going to retreat? If America can't guarantee that Israel doesn't strike Qatar, if Israel can't guarantee that China doesn't invade Taiwan, if Israel can't guarantee that Russia doesn't attack Latvia, then why would any of these countries become allied with America? If Russia can't guarantee that Rwanda doesn't attack the Congo, why would anyone expect America to protect Venice, French Guinea from Venezuela? And in a world like that, what happens to America itself? If we're just another country among all other countries? How will we turn out if we continue on this route we are in? We've already heard about the housing crisis. We've already heard about the military misadventures, and that money's spent, that money's gone, that opportunity has passed. We can't go back. So how do we go forward? It's not clear. I'll continue in this book next time, and it'll talk about history first. So we'll go back in time before we go forward again. Today's me. I think half of this has just been me blabbering about the political issues of today, of America. And it's also the political issues of the world, right? What do other countries want? What sort of world do they want? The EU is such that it likes to stay very cozy and safe and doesn't want to go on adventures. China wants complete control over its local area. Russia wants to become a great empire. All the countries in Africa want to either kill half their population or become rich. All the countries in South America want to become rich, but also not have drug issues. But for all that, what does the United States of America want? What does my country want the future to be or to look like? Because it's not going to turn out exactly how we want. It's also not going to be the 1950s or the 60s or the 70s or the 80s or the 90s or the 2000s again. Different world, different place, different technologies, different rising powers, and how do we confront that? Even with our own internal politics, we aren't going back to the days of massive production. We're going back to the boom time days. We aren't even going back to the Great Depression. We're going back to something different. You know, the price of America's empire is a price we've been willing to pay for a while. And if we pay it no longer, what happens? Because the real question is who benefits? And I can come up with all sorts of ideas and reasons, right? For the positives and negatives. America caused a civil war in my country here. America donated a bunch of food to my country there. Inside the States, the American hegemonic power is very useful for the finance industry. American hegemonic power has not been good for American production. But it's been good for the American consumer. But it hasn't been good for the American worker. There's positive and negatives up and down all around. This is the ground we tread. It's the place we've been living in since the Day of the Dead, when everything changed. And I guess that was really, 1991, and then 9/11. Then the financial crisis, and then COVID, and what's next? It looks to be a political crisis caused by no outside interference, no economic malaise, caused by cultural issues of all things. I guess I'm just tired, really, of reading about the States and reading the same stories for 20 years. Again, next time we'll go into the history a bit. This book will go into the history, and I won't whine so much, having gotten my expressions out, but the shadow of my thoughts right now remains.